The Guyana Defense Force. The Republic of Guyana, that small Caribbean country that is located on the northeastern tip of South America, got its independence from Great Britain on the 26th of May 1966. Just prior to this big occasion, the British authorities began putting together what was to become the Guyana Defense Force. This Guyana Defense Force has its origins in the then British Guyana Volunteer Force. Members of this new defense force were also drafted from the British Special Services Unit and the British Guyana Police Force. A few British Guyanese war veterans as well as some civilians were also included in this first draft, and training was provided by British instructors. The GDF was then officially launched on November 1, 1965. Hi there. And welcome once again to Forgotten Stories, with Aaron Darcy. I am your host Aaron Darcy. Thanks for joining me on this journey through time as we explore some of the events that shaped the history of Guyana and the Caribbean. In today's podcast we take a look at the personnel makeup and the perceived role of the Guyanese army as a tool of the PNC over the decades after independence, when this political party ruled the newly independent Guyana. Prior to independence from Great Britain, the country's internal and external security was managed by the British authorities, who of course did what it took to maintain rigid control of the local population. There are two notable occasions when such control was put on display. Namely the suspension of the British Guiana Constitution on October 8, 1953, and the subsequent deployment of British troops inside the colony, and again during the infamous riots of 1962-63 when British troops were brought in to establish and maintain order. Stories of the horror of that period have been amply described elsewhere. Of course, the British Guyana Volunteer Force and the British Guyana Police Force had significant roles in both these exercises. Anyone signing up for or drafted into military service at that time and afterwards knew that the role of the military services was primarily to enforce strict control of the local population. There is no doubt, therefore, that recruiting into the British Guyana Defense Force and thereafter, the Guyana Defense Force, and by extension, the Guyana Police Force, has been heavily influenced or tainted by this mindset, which was to keep the locals from getting out of hand. But why or how was this attitude cultivated? Perhaps more answers can be found by looking at the history of the country's political struggles. Early in 1950, the two main political organizations in British Guyana, the Political Affairs Committee headed by Cheddi Jagan and the British Guyana Labour Party led by Forbes Burnham, merged to create the People's Progressive Party. Cheddi Jagan was chosen as the leader of this new party, Forbes Burnham as its chairman and Janet Jagan as secretary. This original People's Progressive Party was created to present a unified front to the colonial rulers and to demand self-governance from Great Britain. But this show of political unity was seen as a threat to the colonial powers because at that time in the West, there was widespread fear of communism which had developed after the end of the Second World War. The British government thought that this show of political unity displayed signs of Marxist-Leninist influence, which could encourage the Soviet Union to establish a foothold in South America and British West Indian colonies. In the USA, McCarthyism, also known as the Second Red Scare, was being used in the persecution of left-wing groups and individuals. This was a campaign that spread fear of alleged communist influence on American institutions and of Soviet espionage in the United States during the late 1940s through the 1950s. One of the then British ministers, in referring to British Guyana, was quoted as saying, "We ought surely to get American support in doing all we can to break the communist teeth in British Guyana, and sir, even then, the idea that a communist party was in the making in British Guyana alarmed the colonial rulers and their powerful allies in the US. At that point, a plan was engineered to get rid of that part of the political front that seemingly posed a threat to the authorities. Interestingly, the perceived enemy of the colonial rulers at that time became the opposition party, after a more suitable government was put in place by the British and Americans. The army and police at that time were trained by the colonial officers to forcefully put down any opposition to their authority, and members of these forces knew exactly what their roles were. So when control of these forces was handed over to the new government, it continued to be used to severely restrict any opposition to their authority. The army and police force of the newly independent Guyana were used as, and perceived to be, the private security forces of the ruling party, and this created a serious division among the people of the new Guyana that has lasted for decades. The vast majority of these two forces has always consisted of supporters of the ruling PNC, so anyone who opposed their politics, mainly supporters of the opposition PPP, were considered to be a threat to the authority of the ruling PNC and perhaps enemies of the state. And so, these forces were used in many different ways to do the bidding of the party in power. But, it must be noted that this very GDF was also used in the actual defense of Guyana's territorial sovereignty. In January 1969 to be exact, the GDF prevented a revolt against the government, which began in the Rupununi district. We discussed that in another episode of this podcast. So, let's return to examining the makeup or the composition of the GDF and GPF and their perceived roles as servants of the PNC party, not of the Guyanese people, at least up until the beginning of the 21st century. From the viewpoint of the ordinary man in Guyana, people joining the GDF and the GPF knew that they were expected to be loyal to the PNC and not necessarily to the rule of law. They knew that they were expected to suppress the locals, specifically a certain section of the population. Were these aggressive actions by soldiers and police against opposition supporters racially motivated? Or were they so immersed in their roles as protectors of the party in power that they could not think as individuals? And was the personnel makeup mostly of a particular ethnic background? Again, history shows that this was definitely so. History is filled with examples of this misuse of the armed forces, stealing election ballot boxes to perpetuate election fraud being the least of these. There was also a period of time when bandits used to kick down the doors of ordinary citizens and rob, rape, loot and shoot their victims. Stories abounded of collusion between these bandits and elements within the GDF and police force. Again, that racial strife and division that appeared to question the loyalty of the armed forces. The dawn of the 21st century witnessed a jailbreak that released a group of prisoners, and what followed their escape was a reign of murder and mayhem upon the citizens of Guyana for well over 2 years. History has noted that the majority of the victims were of a particular ethnic background who were perceived to be supporters of the party now in power, while those who rampaged and terrorized were believed to be in some way associated with the party now in opposition. Let's take a moment to consider the role of the armed forces of any nation which is to support and defend the constitution of the nation against all enemies, foreign or domestic, and to maintain, by timely and effective military action, the security of the nation, its possessions and areas vital to its interest. It might be argued that not every individual soldier or policeman was inclined to be partial in the performance of their duties, but the perception in the minds of most Guyanese was that each soldier and policeman knew that loyalty to the PNC was paramount to any other consideration. That loyalty was plainly demonstrated during the reign of the PNC and begs the question, was this loyalty to that party responsible for the creation of racial division among Guyanese people? And now, that the reins of power have been handed over to the other side, will the proverbial tables be turned? It is of vital importance that responsible citizens of Guyana examine this situation and find lasting answers to these questions, especially in view of the ongoing threat from Venezuela. Guyana's western neighbor has always wanted and claimed the entire Essequibo region, and now more than ever, seems to be upping the ante in their game. A map of Venezuela has for decades shown Essequibo as part of that country. Guyanese will certainly not be seen as supporters of one party or the other when the enemy decides to invade or annex part of the country. They will not be regarded as belonging to one ethnicity or another, but everybody will be treated as Guyanese. It is true that the younger generations of Guyanese don't seem to be burdened by ethnicity or party affiliation, but there still needs to be a concerted effort to create a Guyanese identity. And over the past few years, the current president seems to be pushing for the creation of such an identity, and this needs to be relentlessly pursued, for without this, Guyana and its people will remain a house divided. The military forces of the country must be seen as defenders of Guyana and Guyanese people, and so there needs to be a national effort to reshape the makeup and purpose of the GDF as a force for the defense of Guyana and not a servant of any political party. Thanks for joining us as we continue to explore some of the events from our past and getting to know more about the place we call our country. I certainly look forward to sharing so much more with you on the next episode of Forgotten Stories from Guyana and the Caribbean. Goodbye for now.